Philippians 2. Philippians 2. You'll put a finger there. And then if you'll take your other hand and flip like this over to John chapter 1. Just kind of do that little fold thing, get over to John chapter 1. Unless, of course, you're in the technology age, and then you just punch the little thing at the button that says John, and then you... John chapter 1. John chapter 1. I see everyone flipping pages so effectively. Flipping pages so effectively. John chapter 1. Starting in verse 19. Now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. And he did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Messiah. I am not the chosen one. I am not the Christ. They asked him then, who are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? He said, no. Finally, they said, who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What is it you say about yourself? John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, I am the voice of one calling in the desert. Make straight the way for the Lord. You know, when we come to services, I don't know what you think about when you come to services. I know I think about a lot of things. I think about, my flaws. I think about my recent failures. I think about the text. I think about worship. I think about what it will look like when God kind of opens up the heavens and makes the kingdom more visible in our space. I think about what it would be like to have people from the neighborhoods getting the rumor that there's something that God is doing in that church. I think about wanting for us as a collective body to discover the beauty of Christ, the majesty of God, and the witness of the body kind of all rolled into one. And I think the secret to that is for us to look beyond this moment and look beyond the me and the worship leaders and the people in the back and even the people to our left and our right, and to look for the one that is sent to us, which is Christ. Because I really believe that the Holy Spirit is among us as a fellowship. And his desire is that we would notice Christ and that we would set our affections on Jesus. And that the secret to all the things that we most want in this life aren't found by brilliant theologians and brilliant theologies, although that's important. You have to have good theology. It's not found by having the greatest job with the most money, although we need some funds to make life work. It's not found in having the greatest health, although I prefer it when my body doesn't hurt, much the same as you. I see the nodding heads, okay? The greatest secret to having a life with satisfaction and hope is to find what it was that the Pharisees were going out to look for. They just didn't know they were looking for it. That they were going out to see what this guy was doing, and what John the Baptist offered them was this Jesus that could go beyond their wildest dreams and would soon do just that. And as I sat today listening to pieces, that was our starting point for today's conversation about Philippians. Because if we look at Philippians and we only see a letter written by a guy in a jail cell to a group of believers 1900 and some odd years ago, I think we're going to miss the point of what Paul is trying to get across to his Philippian church. That Paul wants that Christ will be formed in them, because that is the starting point for all of what they really want in life. So now, since your finger is still sort of there in your technological Bibles, will you push a few buttons and go back to Philippians with me? I see Melissa there. She's pulling her phone out. Philippians chapter 2, we read it earlier. Now I'm going to reread this. We're not in a rush today, and I don't really care if I get through all the things that I've sketched out, but I would like for us to listen to the scriptures a little bit. So we're going to start reading again, but we're going to start up in verse, the end of 18. As Paul says, I will continue to rejoice, verse 19, Philippians 1:19. Paul writes to them, this is what we talked about last week, for I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Christ Jesus, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Last week we talked about how the secret to joy in our challenges is to have a right perspective. A perspective that God is with us in our challenges, that Jesus is coming to us in our challenges. I think it's Philip Yancey who coined the phrase, and it might not have been original to him, that God speaks to us in our lives, but he shouts to us in our pain in ways that God cuts through so many of the things that are distractions when we have things that rattle us in our interior lives. But even here, as Paul writes back to the Philippians, he's saying, I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Christ, what has happened to me is going to turn out for my deliverance, my eternal deliverance, and maybe even my physical deliverance. And we talked last week about how in our circumstances there are all these things that are challenges. And sometimes the way seems dark, but we're reminded that God has things that he's trying to cultivate in us. And they're for our good. And they will actually turn out for our salvation, for our deliverance, both eternally and even in the present. Verse 20, for I eagerly expect and hope I will no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. But what shall I choose? I do not know. He's almost kind of speaking rhetorically. It's like we get this moment into Paul's thinking as he's writing this and he's reflecting. For me to live as Christ and to die as gain, heaven must be great to be with the Christ that I met on the road to Damascus. That must be an awesome place. For me to live, I'm chained to this guy and I'm writing this set of believers that I have in my heart with tenderness and affection, but to live as Christ, I'm going to live Christ no matter whether I'm here or not, whether I'm chained or not, no matter what's going on in my circumstances or not. But oh, heaven must be a nice place. Not only the secret of joy is that we remember that God has a plan, we need to keep perspective, we also keep our minds on Christ. The secret for us to have joy in the turmoil of this world is to keep our mind on Christ. That Christ is with us, Christ is for us, Christ has redeemed us, Christ is in heaven arguing our case as our advocate, your case for all those failures last week. You know, the ones that you tote around because you just can't get it right often enough? The ones where you keep trying and still it goes out the window? The ones where you hope not to be doubtful or fearful, but yet you are? And Jesus is still in heaven interceding on behalf of your weakness and the flesh that screams, sometimes ever so loudly. Meditate on Christ, that Christ would be in your life, formed today with a heaven that's yours for the future. But then Paul continues. But which do I choose? Verse 23, I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary. When I read that, I thought, what? Who is writing? Who writes more necessary? I mean, that to me just sounds like a grammatical headache, but anyway, it's not my version. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you, again, your joy in Christ Jesus will overflow on account of me. So he says what? He says, my circumstances aren't going to get me. My Jesus is bigger than all these things. And if I'm here, I'm going to invest myself in you for your joy and for your progress in the faith. I'm here for you. Now, it's important to have those three things in mind, because when we get to this next section, as he talks about some of the values, the actions, and the attitudes that he wants us to have, we have to have those pictures in mind about our perspective, about Christ, and about being here for each other's joy and development. Because the next challenges that he offers us don't work if it's about me. They don't work if it's about my life, my comfort, my joy, my personal exaltation. They only work if it's about Jesus and Jesus' kingdom. Because in verse 27, he says, whatever happens, whatever that is. Now, in his context, he was saying to the Philippian church, whether Nero persecutes you. I mean, it wasn't that far from Nero. Remember, they burned all the Christians? Whether your culture, they were in kind of a Roman city. They were a combination of Romans, Gentiles and Jewish believers, but more Roman. It was a Roman colony. And as they didn't worship the idols, they got flack from the Romans. They couldn't exactly go into the synagogue because they got flack from the Jews. So it wasn't really a pretty place to be. But he's saying whatever happens. And they didn't have like all the money in the world. They were like us. They're struggling to get by. But he's saying whatever happens. And I think this is a throwback to that verse 18, 19. That I know that what is happening to me is for my good. I know that what's happening to me is really because God has good for us. And for you as a community of faith. Because we have to remember, he's writing back to the people in Philippi. It's not a message that's addressed to Nick at Philippi. It's to his whole table. In fact, it's to all those tables. It's to the whole body in Philippi. So he's writing back to the whole body in Philippi, saying, you guys. In Pittsburgh's, it would be yous. Yuns. Here it's in y'all. It's written to y'all, or yuns. That's what it would be, yuns. That's Pittsburgh. Teach a Pittsburgh word. Use that this week. They'll be like, where are you from? You say, I don't know. Whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. I think this is the controlling phrase for this next part. I mean, as you look at this, and what does that say to you? Whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. What is a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ? When I think about my kids, one of my hopes, as I had kids, and I had two, that when we would go out, they would not embarrass me. Now, as they got older, it was more that I would not embarrass them. But when they were little, it was that I didn't want them to embarrass me, which really means that when we were going through the store and we got to the checkout line and they picked up the gum and I said, put that back, that they did not throw a tantrum that drew the attention of everyone in the store to my aisle. I did not want them to embarrass me. I preferred that if they had those little poos that they did in their diaper, that it was the kind that was, easy to manage and didn't happen at the store without some place to change that kid. Okay? I did not want them to embarrass me. Now, as they got older, like I said, they did not want me to embarrass them by my singing in public, by my talking to strangers, by my antics, telling things in church about my children. As they've gotten older then all of a sudden it's back to I don't want to be embarrassed by them. Like they're old enough to make decisions now. So I'd like them not to end up in prison. I'd like them not to be arrested. I'd like them to live virtuously. And I'd like not to hear rumors that they're not. I mean, you're the same, right? I mean, you have your kids and your grandkids, and you think, well, I don't really want, whatever happens, whatever they do, I'd like them to conduct themselves in a manner worthy of my name. So that when people hear about me, they don't roll their eyes and go, oh, you're their mother. You're their father. Now I know where they got that vocabulary. Whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. As he writes, he's writing because he wants them to remember the gospel of Christ, the person of Christ that is in them and for them, the Christ that died on the cross, that took away their sin, that transferred them from darkness into the kingdom of light, that he rescued them from the pit of their despair and he placed them on a rock that is clean and pure and holy and virtuous, not because they were great, but because he loved them. Remember, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. So how do you do that? Now, a lot of us, we think in terms of, if we're going to conduct ourselves worthy of the gospel, we think in terms of visibility. I mean, we think we need to come to church. If we don't come to church, people are going to look down on us. We think about, our reputation at work. We're underhanded, people will find out. I think we're frequently more concerned that they think badly about us than they think badly about our Christ. But over it all, I think it comes back that we want a reputation to be good, particularly if you've been in church a long time. We tend to think, okay, I want people to think well of me. I don't know. I don't see Paul trying to attack their externals in this text. I get a sense that he's really trying to nudge their internals. Almost as if what is happening inside is more important than what's happening on the outside. In fact, it's a derivative. I mean, what you do on the outside is really just a reflection of what you do on the inside. Same with me. Because then he says, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, your reputation, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith in the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. So it doesn't matter how many people are against you. It doesn't really matter who is your opposition, what's going on, whether it's Nero, whether it's the culture, whether it's your fellow Christians, whether it's people in your family, whoever doesn't understand the calling that God has on you, that you're walking by faith and not by sight, doesn't matter. Don't be frightened by them. But what's the secret to that? It's the internal compass we have of unity of heart around Jesus. He's saying, I want you to be captivated by the singular thing of Jesus being your everything. I want you to be, and it's almost like the one thing. It's the one, what does it say? One Spirit as one man in one gospel. I mean, isn't that the essence of it? It's one Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, one man, the body, one body in your church, the Church of Philippians, the Church of First Alliance Church, one Spirit, one body, and one gospel. And there were lots of gospels then. There was the gospel of whoever your famous person was. I mean, Paul wrote in Corinthians, some follow Paul, some follow Apollos. He gets back to say, it only matters if you follow Jesus. So there are some gospels where it's the prosperity gospel. You do all the right stuff and you give your money and it all should work out so you get wealthy, a prosperity gospel. There's the think it good and it will happen to you gospel. It's the Jesus and you just think right gospel. There's the gospel of good church attendance, where I'm a Christian, I do church, and everything works out. So we have all these gospels. But when he says the one gospel, it's the singular, it's the one. It's the be identified with the Christ that rose from the dead and took away our sins and is heaven interceding on our behalf gospel. One Spirit, one body, one gospel. And he doesn't just say it there, he also says it over in chapter 2. Because he says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, come from his love and fellowship with the Spirit, tenderness, compassion, chapter 2, verse 2, then make my joy complete by being like-minded. What does that say? Does that say, have like all these different factions in your church? Doesn't seem like it says it to me. Now, thankfully, we don't have a lot of that. Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Like there's a singularity here. There's a singleness. Stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith. Verse 28, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. Now, verse 29 is kind of a challenge. Take a look at it. What are the two things that he highlights in 29? Take a look. Only take you a second. They stand out really easy. Okay, there are two things: to believe in him and then to suffer. What does it say? For it has been granted to you. That idea of granted is to be bestowed, like from a higher to a lower. When I bestow on my child car insurance, it's a gift, it's given to him. To bestow, to give, it's to grant. For it has been granted to you, to the Philippian church, on behalf of Christ, the one gospel, one Spirit, one body, to not only believe on him, but also to suffer for him. I'm okay with the believe on him part. I kind of like the believe on him part. I am not so excited about the suffering part, if I could be honest. And it doesn't matter if it's suffering from my backache, suffering from my stomach troubles, suffering from the crink that gets in my neck from time to time. I don't like to suffer. And in fact, if I had my preference, I would wish for a life that was, rather pampered. I mean, wouldn't you? I mean, which of you get up in the beginning of the day and say, I'd like to work myself to death and go to bed flat exhausted and get up tomorrow and do the same thing? I don't know any of us that say that. I mean, if you were bequeathed a whole bunch of money, you might keep your job, but you might not work there quite as long every day. Okay, yeah, so a little honesty here. So none of us really relish the suffering thing. In spite of how over and over in the epistles, Paul talks about the benefits of struggle. I mean, you can look at James, you can look at Peter. The testing of your faith works this, and it develops this, and it develops this. Some of the things that we develop in our lives that are of the greatest quality are the pieces that come because we've fought through and that we've noticed Jesus is with us. We have to not lose hope when we struggle to see why the pains in our lives continue. It's really easy to give up hope. It's really easy to listen to the deceiver when he whispers in our ears, God is not as good as you think he is. God is not faithful like you read in Scripture. God won't be faithful to you. You don't deserve it. You're not good enough. You don't get it right often enough. You know how often you fill in your blank. Because you got the buttons just like I do. And we get the sense that when we suffer, we're alone. And what he keeps trying to get us back to is he's writing to the body to say, you are not alone. You are one of a group. You're a team. We're here together. It's one for all for one. In the words of those famous musketeers, all for one for all. Chapter 2. If you have any encouragement from me united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, and any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, if you lack these things, that may be a sign to you that your spiritual journey has some holes. Now, I'm not saying that you're in left field, but I'm saying you ought to look at which field you're on. If you don't have a sense of being united with Christ, if being loved by him in spite of all the things that are blunders in your life, if being loved by him is irrelevant in your everyday world, if you never sense the Spirit of God nudging you about things that are right and wrong in your life, if there's no tenderness and compassion, like that, you ought to ask yourself, what's going on in my spiritual life? Now, it may just be that you're in a dry spot, to be honest. I mean, it might just be you're in a wilderness. But maybe that there's something that God has been trying to finesse in you that has been hard to develop. I don't know. Because he says, if you have any of these things, this compassion, this is kind of a description, sort of like the fruit of the Spirit, that he wants to develop in you as a follower of Jesus. Because he loves you and he wants you to experience the joy of his presence and the love that goes beyond all of our failures and his faithfulness in spite of our struggle to get it right all the time. And it says, if you have any of these things, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Then he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. How hard is this for you? Man, this is terrible hard for me. I have a confession. I am all about me. Now, I try not to be, okay? I'll be honest. I try not to be. I try to make it all about Marcia. But it's hard. Now, she's good and all. Don't get me wrong, okay? She's nice. I'm really happy. But it's hard. I mean, I try to make it all about my kids. I love my kids. Sometimes they're a pain in the neck. You know, we fundamentally are wired so it's all about me. And we like it that way. And we're not shy about it. Now, we might be a little shy about admitting it. But I think fundamentally we kind of, we violate a lot of these things. Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love. The same love as Christ, the same love for one another. Being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also the interests of others. How do we practice that? Like, how do you live that out in regular life? Do you consciously put other people ahead of yourself? Do you consciously take on tasks that you know other people don't like to do? I have a friend that I have spent some time with over this last week who is newly married 2-3 years. And his family was one that always kept the sink empty after every meal. His wife was from a family where they stacked the dishes up until they were ready to do them. And he said to me, "You know how hard it is for me to stare at that sink and watch those dishes stack up there?" I was like, "Yeah." When we were first married, we had this competition to see who could stack the dishes highest and which would feel guilty about doing them first. And I have a feeling our family was not all that different than your family. I mean, we all have these things that drive us crazy. But the question isn't, what does it drive us crazy? The question is, are we willing to put others' interests ahead of our own and get in and do the dishes? See, I would come home and the dishes would be stacked up, and Marcia was doing stuff through the day, and I was critical as a husband. And I would come in and I would do dishes the angry way. You know. Wash, right? You'd have thought they were going to break sometimes, to be honest. I was not very good at doing this. And it was something that God was working on me, that Christ would be formed in me through that suffering, and suffering in the most loose sense of the word, but the struggle nonetheless. And it's true to this day. You know, sometimes I get really critiquey of people that don't behave the way I want them to behave. It's really easy for me to get critical of other people. You do the same thing. I've been with enough of you, and I've listened to you ramble about stuff that annoy you. People in church, people out of church, family members, kids, co-workers, I know. But some of what Jesus is doing is he's trying to rub off the pieces of us that aren't like Jesus. He's trying to take our eyes off of John the Baptist and put our eyes on the coming Messiah. Now, the question is, how? That's the $24,000 question. How do we do it? How do we get a perspective where all these things work together for good? How do we live with Jesus so in our forefront that heaven is great and to live as Christ and to die as gain? How do we approach each other like we have gifts to give others and we have gifts to receive from others in discipleship and communion? Where others' progress in their faith is our joy. How do we have a singular heart where we're one spirit, one body, and one gospel? Isn't that a great question? I wish I had a great answer. I wish I had a great picture. The truth is that you and I are really hopeless to do these things. The truth is that we're trapped in a world where we frequently think that God is small and powerless. And most of us live there more often than we want to admit. But the truth is that Jesus, who willingly traded his life for ours, invites us to enter into a faith connection with Him. To enter into a spiritual dimension where Jesus pours His power and His grace into us. He invites us to enter into a fresh awareness where Jesus Himself meets us in our time of need in ways that we have not even yet thought about. And He gives us hopefulness in our desperation, and He gives us joy in our struggle, and He gives us satisfaction in our disappointments. But it only comes to those who come to Him to receive His gifts of grace. But see, that is the remarkable, brain-blowing idea, that He in and of Himself would do that for us. That He would say, "Come unto me, all you are heavy laden, and I will give you a rest that you have no idea where it comes from or how it gets there." But that somehow Jesus wants to enter into our suffering in ways that redeem it, in ways that transform our senses of inability and inferiority, and gives us a sense of His power and His pleasure that go beyond our ability to figure it out. And that's the miracle of Jesus. That's the miracle where Jesus enters into our life, like He did with Paul. And even though he's chained to this guy, and he's got marks on his wrist, and his belly is rumbling, and his backside is tired because the stone or wherever he's sitting doesn't have enough cushion, that even though he's got this discomfort, and even though he doesn't know whether he's going to be freed or killed at any point, Jesus is precious to him. Because in his suffering, he turned and found that Jesus was enough for his heartache. Are we willing to come to Jesus and ask Jesus to do that thing in us? Are we willing to give up our small thoughts around money and possessions and trade them for Jesus and His ability to provide? See, I think that's the most important question when we come to church. I mean, church is a moment in time. It's a moment. It's an hour. It's an hour that for most of us, we struggle to not be distracted. But it's just 1 hour in our regular, in a whole week. Like, this 1 hour only sharpens us a little. Jesus wants to be formed in us as a body as we live life together every day of our restless week. He wants to be formed in us on Mondays and Tuesdays when we're fatigued after a long day at work. And as we drive home, He wants to hear us whisper a prayer, "God, I'm tired. Jesus, I need your help so I don't kill my kids or yell at my spouse. I want you to be with me in this heartache." Jesus wants us on Thursday or Friday when the money starts running out to say, "Jesus, I know that I don't have enough money to take care of all these ends that need to go together. Will you please provide for us?" Like, those are the realities. And so on this day, all we really do is we remind ourselves. We remind ourselves that God is big, and that God is loving, and that God is generous, and that God's plans for us far exceed our dreams for ourselves. And as we bathe ourselves in this text through this upcoming week, particularly next week we're going to talk about this attitude of Christ. See, this is the secret to us being a compelling congregation. A compelling congregation in our neighborhoods and where we work and with our families. That this secret of Christ in us as a compelling entity, not just some, whatever, but that Jesus is big in us. And Jesus only gets big when we get small. So as we close, we're going to close in prayer. And I don't know where you are in your space. I don't know what's going on in your life. But I would ask that you would come and pray. You would come and pray for your family. That you'd come and pray for your work environment. That you come and pray for whatever is your headache. And that in coming, you would be humbling yourself to say, God, I want you to come and be with me in my space. I want Jesus to be with me and to do more in me than what I can imagine. It's almost like saying, my car battery is nearly dead. I want you to come and I want you to replace the battery in my life. That it would be a reservoir of power that would help me in every day start the car again and again for your glory and for your praise. Now, I don't know where you are. I don't know what your deal is. I don't know what your problems are. I know some of them, but that's not really my concern. My real concern is that Jesus would be formed in you in all of his glory and that you would find his goodness for the mystery of your life. And that only comes as we bow ourselves like those Pharisees who went out to see John the Baptist and they said, please tell us who you are. And John the Baptist said, I am not he. There's one coming that is the man. What he was saying is if you put your heart toward the man, he'll take care of your needs. He'll take care of you, whatever that means. Is that where you are today? Are you ready to have Jesus be more in you than ever? That he would do these things in you? Would you just pray? Ask him. Beg that he would. Come and pray. Pray where you are and kneel where you are as the worship team comes.